If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to Acts chapter 16. Paul and Silas, Timothy and Luke are now together, and they're traveling together. And they wanted to go north on the mainland into Galatia, into Bithynia, the far northern portions of Galatia and Phrygia, and they're being prevented, which in some ways sounds like a negative, but it's actually not, as we'll see as we go into this. And they're pressed on down the coast into Troas, where they get a boat and they sail to Samothrace and then to Neapolis, which is the port of Philippi. There's something that emerges from this text. There are two branches of theistic understanding. Now that's a big 50-cent word. All it means is theism comes from theos, the Greek, which is God. That's what it means. And if you and I, if we are followers of Jesus, we are theists. A theist is a person who doesn't just believe in a God, but also believes in a God who is personal and who answers prayer, who intervenes, who's participant in the creation. There's another branch of theism known as deism, another word you may not be familiar with. A deist believes, and there are many deists, many of the founders of this country were deists. They believe that a person believes that there's a God who created everything, flung it all out there, and then just sits back and observes as it all moves about with no intervention whatsoever, no concern for you or me or the rocks or the trees or anything else. That's a deist. The distinction is either God is participating in our lives or He's not. That's the distinction. And so, if God moves in our lives, then does He endorse what we want, or does He move us in places that He wants? That's the question before us today. We're in chapter 16. We're in verse 6, which is where I'll begin. Paul and his companions traveled throughout the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been kept by the Spirit from preaching the word in the province of Asia. When they came to the border of Mysia, they tried to enter Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them to go there. So they passed by Mysia, went down to Troas, and during the night Paul had a vision of a man from Macedonia standing and begging him, "Come to Macedonia and help us." After Paul had seen the vision, we, which is a very important we, got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. From Troas we put out to sea and sailed straight for Samothrace, and the next day on to Neapolis. From there we traveled to Philippi, about an 8-mile walk. To a Roman colony, a leading city of that district of Macedonia. We stayed there for several days. On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak there to the women who had gathered. One of those listening was a woman named Lydia, a dealer in the color purple, from the city of Thyatira, who was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message, and when she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. "If you consider me a believer in the Lord," she said, "please come and stay at my house." And she persuaded us to stay. Now, Paul and Silas, Luke and Timothy, there are 4 of them now. And this is very significant. You notice the text said we. All right, Paul's the chronicler of the book of Acts. And now Luke is the chronicler of the book of Acts. And now Luke is traveling with them. He's not just chronicling this from what other people tell him. He's actually an eyewitness to these things. So that's a very different thing now that has happened. They wanted to go north into the northern regions of Galatia, a place called Bithynia. And God stopped them. He said, "No, you're not going there." So they wind up in Philippi. Neapolis is the port city for Philippi, which is on the mainland. And the interesting thing, Philippi is named after Alexander the Great's dad, Philip of Macedonia. That's where the name Philippi comes from. So this city has an ancient history. By this time in history, it's already 300 plus years old. So the text says they sailed straight to Samothrace. That's a nautical term. I didn't know that. It was only through studying the history of this text that I learned that that's a Greek nautical term. And what it means is they had the wind at their backs. This journey normally takes a week from the mainland to Neapolis. and it only took them a day to sail to Samothrace and one more day to sail to Neapolis. 150-mile journey in a boat over 2 24-hour periods. That's pretty fast for those days, and that meant they had the wind at their back. It took 5 days for them to come back, just to give you some perspective. Samothrace is an interesting place. There's a statue. How many of you, I know everybody in this room, well, maybe not, because I just grew up liking cars a lot, history of cars. On a Packard and a Duesenberg, they have a hood ornament. And it's a woman with her arms out this way. She's wearing these flowing robes and wings behind her, and she's leaning forward. That's a statue. That's a reproduction of what's known as Winged Victory. They found that statue. It's a 200-year-old before Christ carved statue out of marble that they found on the island of Samothrace. There's a lot of history there. And Philippi was this ancient town that was founded by Alexander's father. By this time in history, about 150 years later, the Romans took it over. When the empire expanded, they took it over. It has become, as the text says, a Roman colony. That's not just an incidental title. It means something. If you were a Roman citizen living on the mainland, and you would voluntarily go and live in one of these far-flung places, and back then 150, 200 miles is a far-flung place, if you would go live there, they would relieve you from all taxes for the rest of your life. I would sign up for that. I would go there right today if somebody would say, if you'll move here, I'll take away all your taxation. It'd be hard to resist. So the population of Philippi became very cosmopolitan because a lot of different kinds of people wound up going there. But there's something interesting about Philippi. There is no synagogue in Philippi. None. That's what happens when they meet Lydia. They meet Lydia and this group of women. Lydia is a Jewess, but she's a proselyte. She's a Gentile. She's not a native Jew. She's not ethnically Jewish. And she's become converted. That's why the text says she was a God worshiper. That was the kind of official term at that time in history, wherein a person who became converted to Judaism left paganism because of all of the many gods and goddesses and all the dissatisfactions therein. They wanted something solid. They came to Judaism, which was all there was. That was the only monotheistic understanding on the earth at the time, other than Zoroastrianism, which is really kind of a polytheistic in that there's two deities. So we won't go there just now. But Lydia and her group are gathered at the riverside at a place of prayer. That's a technical description. It means that this is the only place Jews could gather on the Sabbath to pray, to have a service, so to speak. She's a dealer in the color purple. Now that may not mean anything to us, but to them it meant a lot. Miss Janelle's wearing some purple. Looking, she's the only one I see. Well, KG's burgundy shirt kind of borders on purple, I suppose. But what you have to realize is that color dyeing, the dyeing of fabrics in that day was not an easy process. They didn't have chemicals. There was no DuPont. So in order to dye a fabric a color, it required usually plant or animal matter in order to do it. The color purple was a very unique color. It came from a shellfish called a murex, about the size of a large periwinkle. And if you were a dealer in the color purple, what you had to do was you had to gather these shellfish, very much like a squid. You know, if they're threatened, they expel ink. The murex, for whatever reason, produces this particular dye within its body. And what they would do is it would take thousands of these things to make here, just let me give you a perspective. I did the math. If you have a good Bible dictionary, in the back you've got a thing called metrology. And what that is a place where you figure out weights, measures, currencies, and they say, well, a shekel was worth this in American dollars in 2017. It would cost $700 in today's to $1,000, roughly in that range, to dye 1 pound of wool. That's just the wool. There's no garment yet. It's just the raw fibers. It would take $700 to $1,000 worth of the color purple gathered from these shellfish to dye 1 pound of wool. And you can only make a small garment out of 1 pound of wool. So you can imagine what a sweater would cost if it were purple at this time in history. Well, Lydia is a dealer in this. This is how she's made her living. She's a merchant in the color purple. And when she hears the gospel, Paul, they go down to the river. They encounter these women, Paul and his little band, and she hears the gospel, and she and all the women that are with her are born again. Now, what about Lydia? It's funny that she appears here. This is telling us something. There's a way that this text is going to hopefully teach us today that it directly lines up with this meeting with Lydia. She's named Lydia in the text, but her name is actually the same name as the town she comes from. Thyatira was called Lydia before it was called Thyatira. All right, what was Paul's vision that they didn't go into Bithynia and they sailed to Macedonia? What was the vision? What did he have in his vision? What appeared to him that caused them to go to Macedonia? A man from Macedonia who was asking them to come. Who does Paul meet next to the river? A woman. A woman, a bunch of women. There's not a guy here other than the 4 that are traveling with Paul. You see, that's why Paul would be the same apostle that would write. It's all of this is laced together. If you go to Galatians chapter 3, the history of Galatians chapter 3 is this moment in Paul's life. And that's why he would write that towering verse, undoing a rabbinic prayer in which he says there is neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, all are one in Christ Jesus. That's from a rabbi. Paul is being changed. He has a vision. God introduces to Paul in a vision a man from Macedonia. That makes sense. Paul would respond to that. Oh, we need to go to Macedonia. I've seen a man from Macedonia. If God had introduced a woman in the dream, I don't know that Paul would have taken it seriously. But when he gets to Macedonia, the first convert he has is a woman. God knows what he's doing. There's no synagogue on this mainland because in order to have a synagogue, Jewish tradition prescribes, that you have to have at least 10 males. 10 Jewish males in order to have a synagogue. Apparently there aren't 10 Jewish males available in Philippi. So, and think about Lydia herself. How is it that Paul is brought there? By the vision. But when he comes there, he finds a woman who is a Jewish convert, who is not ethnically a Jew. Who does that sound like? That Peter encountered. Sounds just like Cornelius. Somebody who is praying to the maker of the universe, and they don't know anything about Jesus, and somebody is sent to them. You know, people say to me, I bet you've heard it said, what about all the people out in the bushes someplace? They don't know anything about Jesus. Is God going to condemn them to an eternal condemnation? No. If they're out there seeking God, I guarantee you somebody's coming. Paul came to Lydia. Peter came to Cornelius. There are lots of Corneliuses all over the world, and God is sending people to them. And when he can't send a person in there, he'll do what he's doing in some of the Islamic countries. He'll send dreams, and people will be converted. So her prayers were heard. Then you've got so many significant additions. Paul's little band. You remember last week we looked at Timothy. Timothy's traveling with them now. Paul wanted Timothy to come. And Timothy, being from Lystra, the place where Paul was stoned to death, so the text says, who probably became a Christian during Paul's visit there. Timothy's grandmother and mother became believers while Paul was there. And when it says in the text that the disciples gathered around Paul's body after they dragged him out of Lystra thinking him dead, Timothy's likely to be one of those people standing there, and his conversion is a direct result of seeing what God did. I don't have any doubts about it at all. So all of this history that is laced together, that gives us a picture of what it's like to walk day to day to day following the Lord. Paul in Galatians 3 speaks of his physical malady. You know, remember Paul said, there are 3 times I prayed that God would take whatever that was. Now, there's a lot of dispute about what the thorn in the flesh, as it's called. Everybody knows that phrase who's been in church any time at all. Something was wrong with Paul. And I've heard everything from, here's one of the theories, that his eyesight was really, really bad. There's one text that says, I would have torn my eyes out if I could have spoken the gospel to you. There's another text wherein Paul says, see in what large letters I write with my own hand. Maybe he was writing, people theorize he was writing in really big letters because that's all he could see. That's a theory. Another theory was he had kidney stones. Another theory is he had a wife. Now, not to say that Paul's wife was just a pain in the Watusi and Paul just had to put up with her. No, that's not the way the theory goes. The theory with his wife is he had to travel and he had to leave her behind. It was a pain to him. I don't know what the answer is. I'm going to say it's a physical problem. And the reason I say that is the text seems to move me that way. All right, Paul has Luke, the physician, with him now. How come Luke's traveling with him? Maybe because Paul needs some help. You know, when Paul went to Galatia, it says, if you go back and read that history in the letter to the Galatians, he preached there in spite of his illness. Now, that's a very important text. You see, at this time in history, if you had something physically wrong with you, you would not be an evangelist that anybody would listen to. People didn't look at people who were sick with any sense of real sympathy. They looked at them as though, I don't want to be anywhere around this. So you wouldn't be a person who would attract people to yourself if something were wrong with you. So Paul goes to preach in Galatia. They accept him in spite of his illness. That is a lesson in itself. Why do you think Paul writes, when I am weak, then I am strong? I mean, I remember, this is an experience unique to me. It's probably one that you all have had maybe. I don't know. I was teaching a Sunday school class, and just like Miss Janelle, I had a sinus infection, a really bad one. It felt like somebody had driven 2 nails under my cheeks. My whole face just hurt. I went to bed on a Saturday night, and I did not sleep. I went in the office to sleep because I didn't want to keep Becky up, no reason for her to suffer. And I got up the next morning because Becky came in the room, I was awake, and she said, you should just stay home. And I said, I can't. I've made no arrangements for Sunday school, nobody's there, I'm going to go. So she pumped me full of all kinds of chemicals that would help me arrive at Sunday school conscious and alert enough to do the Sunday school class. That was the best Sunday school class I've ever had in my life. Sick, sick, sick. And yet, God, there were people praying for each other. There were people weeping. It was just amazing. I'm just sitting there watching. I was a spectator. God did things because I was not able to do anything. That's so much like Paul. There's a lesson there for us. Now, there's a drum beat in this text, and I want us to hear the drum beat. I think it's important for every person in this room who says that they're a follower of Jesus to hear this drum beat. It's important for me. The first drum beat that we're to hear from this text is God's Spirit can be heard by you and me and understood. That's the first drum beat. You and I can hear God's Spirit. He can speak to us and He can be understood. The second is, look at what happens to Paul. At every turn, Paul is moved to do certain things. By physical difficulty, by other things, the chance encounter on the riverside with the women, the vision. God moves Paul to do certain things. When he decides to go to Bithynia, what happens? Whatever's physically wrong with him shows up. What does that create? Luke's now a traveling companion. He's not traveling alone, just him and Silas. The infirmity causes him to preach to the Galatians. He goes back to the church where he had contacted in Lystra Timothy. Now Timothy's traveling with them. God is doing something here. All these things are not just coincidences. He has the vision. I mean, that's an amazing thing in itself, is it not? You go to bed and you have a vision of something that God is calling you or me to do. And then meeting those women at the place of prayer on the Sabbath day as the woman from Macedonia. But there's another thing that happens here. When I was traveling, we would do our best. How many of you know who Mylon Lefevre is? You know Mylon Lefevre? Christian. He became a Christian in the 70s, and he started with a Christian rock and roll band, and now he went to quartet music lately. And if you pull a hymnal, you can find hymns he's written in the hymnal. Well, we were at his church in Mount Perrin, and we were eating hoagies at the church. Mylon's sitting there. We're all sitting there, and I don't want to. Mylon was a very interesting person to know. His past his thinking wasn't quite what it ought to have been because of what he'd done in his past. Sweet guy. But he had a manager that would book them. He had a map in the manager's office, a huge map. Now this is how Mylon thought, and it makes so much sense when you hear it. Huge map of the country where they were booking Mylon Lefevre and Broken Heart. That was the name of the band. And Mylon, they would book him to be somewhere a day and a half later, 1,000 miles from where he was playing. Because you see, a manager gets a commission from the concerts. Well, if you've got a $2,000 concert in Oregon and you're in Kansas, well, heck, fire. I'm going to send those guys to Oregon. So they would get in their vehicles and drive all night and the next day just to get somewhere. Well, Mylon had had enough of it. So he comes in the office and he's got 2 thumbtacks and a little piece of yarn. And he comes in there to the manager and he says, okay, he says, I want you to take a look at this. This is your gauge from now on. If these thumbtacks with this piece of yarn will not reach, we will not travel any further than this string. And I just thought, what a genius idea. But I can tell you, when we traveled, we tried to book concerts in an area. And the biggest blessing we got, for instance, we went to Dayton, Ohio for about 10 concerts. And they were all within 150 or 200 miles of one spot. And the family from the church that took us in, it was an evangelical free church, they said, why don't you just stay with us for the next 2 weeks and you can just go out to your concerts. You have no idea when you're traveling every day what a blessing that is to you, to be able to come back to one spot and stay there at the night. Know there's going to be a meal. Know there's going to be a place for you to sleep. It's going to be the same place. You have no idea what that means. That's what Lydia did for Paul and this group. Gave them a base of operations so that they could do their mission in Macedonia without having to just want. How many of you have ever moved to a place where nobody in the world knew you were there and who you were? I have too. It's a strange feeling to go to a place where nobody knows you. And if you're a person that's perhaps introverted a little bit, it's even stranger. Paul had Lydia and these women and his band of people that were with him, and now he's got a base of operations. You know what, there's a segment of population that I feel really sorry for. You may think this strange, but I really do. I feel really sorry for telemarketers. I do. Can you imagine what that job is, to go 8-10 hours a day? You know, how many of you have hung up on a telemarketer? Don't raise your hand. I'm sorry, I should have said that first. Okay, well, I have to. As a matter of fact, nowadays you can set your phone up to see the number and not answer. So, but I think of that job. Now we laugh, we make fun of them, but on the other end of that phone, that telemarketer, there's a family connected to that person. That's their living. That's their living. When you're in a place and nobody knows you, you can't imagine the blessing it is to have one place where you can use as a base. Lydia gave that to Paul. And the influence of the gospel spread all over. As a matter of fact, within 30 years of this moment, you read in some of the Roman histories at the time, this pernicious cult has spread all over the Mediterranean, speaking of Christianity. But here's what I want to funnel all this down to for you and me. This is a very practical thing. You and I have the same opportunity to be as Paul, Silas, Timothy, and Luke. God, every person in here who calls the name of Jesus, God is calling you and me all the time. He is placing us in places wherein He's saying to us, do this, do that. For instance, you're sitting in here today. What if God were prompting someone in this room to get up and go put that arm on someone's shoulder for whom you're concerned? He might do that. How many times do we hear that voice and not do that? Lots of times. Lots of times. See, God wants us to be a continuance of the book of Acts. This hasn't stopped. What's happening here is still going on. And it's you and I now who are the actors in the book of Acts. You and I are commissioned by God to continue that book. And I'm just going to say, as one who has occasionally listened and obeyed, you can't believe what that's like. It is intoxicating to be called out by God to do it and to realize you've been called out and obeyed. I don't know where everybody is today, but if there's anything I said about which you've got a